Ever wrestled with a sentence in another language that just keeps going and twisting, and you wonder how anyone, let alone a computer, can make sense of it?
Oh, definitely. It makes you appreciate how much better translation tech has become, right?
Totally. So, what's the secret sauce behind this improvement?
Well, what's fascinating here is a real turning point, I think, in how we approach machine translation. We moved from,
Yeah.
statistical
No,
method.
it's older ones.
Exactly. They were all about breaking down sentences, calculating probabilities, lots of moving parts. But then we shifted to something much more integrated, neural machine translation.
Neural machine translate. Okay, that's the focus for our deep dive today. We're going to explore a really groundbreaking research paper called Neural Machine Translation by Jointly Learning to Align and Translate.
A bit of a mouthful, but a very important paper.
Yeah. Think of this as our backstage pass, to understanding how these sophisticated translation systems really work. Our goal is to pinpoint the fundamental challenge these researchers tackled.
And the pretty ingenious solution they came up with.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, our main source is the research paper itself. The reference is 1909.0473v7.pdf for anyone who wants to look it up.
Yep, that's the one. It really was a seminal work, marked a big leap forward.
Okay, so before this paper, neural machine translation existed, but it was different from those older statistical approaches. Can you give us a quick sort of overview of that shift?
Sure. So traditional statistical machine translation systems, they were quite intricate, lots of separate parts. You had language models, translation models, reordering components.
Sounds complicated.
It was, and each of these had to be fine-tuned independently. The core idea behind neural machine translation, NMT, was to try and create a single large neural network.
Just one big network.
Basically, yeah, one that could learn end-to-end, directly optimizing for translation quality. So the potential was there for a more unified and hopefully more effective system.
That sounds way more efficient. But I remember reading there was a limitation in those early NMT models, a potential bottleneck, right?
That's right. Yeah, a really key limitation. Many of the early models used an architecture called an encoder-decoder.
Encoder decoder,
So
okay.
the encoder would take the source sentence, say, the English sentence, and try to compress its entire meaning,
Yeah.
all of it, into one fixed-length vector.
A single string of numbers, basically.
Exactly, just one fixed representation. Then the decoder would take only that vector and use it to generate the translated sentence word by word.
Okay, I can immediately see how that could be problematic, especially with longer sentences.
Yeah.
It's like trying to summarize a whole movie plot in one tweet, right? You're bound to lose important details.
That's a great analogy. Trying to squash the entire meaning of a potentially long, complex sentence into that single fixed-size representation, it inevitably leads to information loss.
Particularly for those longer, more nuanced sentences.
Precisely. And the researchers behind this paper hypothesized that this fixed-length vector was becoming a major bottleneck. It was limiting the ability of these models to accurately handle longer sentences.
And was there evidence for this?
Yes, actually. Concurrent research around that time had observed that the performance of these basic encoder-decoder models tended to drop off quite significantly as the input sentences got longer.
Okay, so recognizing this bottleneck, the researchers thought there has to be a smarter way.
Right, we can't just force everything into this tiny information package.
So what was their breakthrough idea? How did they move beyond this fixed vector bottleneck?
Their key innovation was, well, to move away from it entirely. Instead of making the encoder squeeze the whole source sentence into one vector,
Yeah.
they proposed a model that learns to soft search. That's the term they used for the specific parts of the original sentence that are most relevant when it's generating each word of the translation.
Ah, so it's not just one summary at the start. It's like
Yeah.
looking back at the source text as it goes.
Exactly. The brilliant insight was shifting from a passive fixed summary to an active dynamic focusing mechanism. The model learns where to look in the source sentence at each step. It doesn't have to try and remember everything perfectly from that one initial vector.
Soft search. I like that. So it's not a rigid one-to-one mapping between words. It's more flexible.
Very flexible. This is where the concept of the attention mechanism, sometimes called soft alignment, comes in.
Attention mechanism. Okay.
So, for every word the decoder is trying to produce in the target language, say, the French word, it calculates a set of weights. One weight for each word in the original English sentence.
Weights, like importance scores.
Kind of, yeah. These weights, they call them alpha in the paper, basically indicate how much attention the model should pay to each source word at that particular moment.
So if it's translating the big dog into French, and it's about to output the word for dog, the attention might put higher weights on dog and maybe big in the English sentence.
That's a good way to think about it intuitively. The model computes these weights based on its current internal state, what it's generated so far, and on something they call annotations of the source words.
Annotations, what are those?
Think of them as rich contextual summaries for each word in the original sentence. The encoder creates these. They capture not just the word itself, but also the words around it.
So context matters.
Hugely. And the higher the weight, the alpha, for a specific source word's annotation, the more important that part of the source sentence is considered for generating the current target word.
And this whole process, the model learns it automatically during training. No human is setting these links manually.
Precisely. That's a key difference from some older statistical methods where alignments were often hidden variables you had to kind of infer. Here, this soft alignment, this attention, is directly computed by a part of the neural network.
Part of the architecture itself.
Yes, an
Yeah.
alignment model, and it's trained jointly, all together, with the rest of the translation system. Learning these relationships directly from the data is a big advantage.
Interesting. And you mentioned these annotations for each source word. How are they actually created in this model?
Good question. They used a specific type of recurrent neural network, or RNN, called a bidirectional RNN, a BRNN, for their encoder.
BRNN. Okay, break that down.
So a standard RNN reads a sentence, from beginning to end, processing words one by one.
Right.
A BRNN does that too. That's the forward RNN. But it also has a backward RNN that reads the same sentence from the end back to the beginning.
Ah, so it gets context from both directions, what comes before and what comes after a word.
Exactly. The annotation for each word is then formed by combining the hidden states, the internal memory, basically from both the forward and backward RNNs at that specific word's position.
How do they combine them?
Typically just by sticking them together end to end, concatenation. So the annotation for a word contains information about both its preceding context and its following context.
That sounds much richer than just a forward pass.
It gives the decoder's attention mechanism a much more context-aware representation of each word in the source sentence to work with.
Okay, so we have this BRNN encoder making these context-rich annotations, and then a decoder with this attention mechanism using them to figure out where to look.
Mm-hmm.
How did they actually test if this whole setup worked better? What kind of experiments did they run?
Right, the proof is in the pudding. They evaluated their proposed model, which they called RNN Search,
RNN search, got it.
on the task of translating English to French. They used a big, publicly available data set from a competition called WMT14. Lots of parallel text English sentences paired with their French translations.
And they needed a comparison point, right?
Absolutely. So they also trained a standard RNN encoder-decoder model, the kind without attention, which they called RNNSTEC. Crucially, they used the exact same data and training procedures for both.
Fair comparison. What about the data itself? Any specifics?
Yeah, they followed a specific process to sort of trim the data set down, ending up with about 348 million words. They also set aside separate data for development, like tuning the model, and a final independent test set to get the real performance measure.
And vocabulary. Computers can't know every word.
True. They focused on the 30,000 most frequent words in each language. Anything else got replaced with a special UNK token for unknown.
Okay. And they trained models with different sentence length limits.
Yes, they trained versions of both RNNTech and RNN Search that handled sentences up to 30 words, and another set that handled sentences up to 50 words.
And the networks themselves, were they huge? Training must take ages.
They were pretty substantial for the time. They used hidden layers with 1,000 units. For the BRNN in RNN Search, that meant 1,000 forward and 1,000 backward units. And yeah, training took several days, even using GPUs to speed things up. They also used some advanced techniques like max-out layers to help with predicting the next word accurately.
Okay, the setup sounds thorough. So, the moment of truth, what were the results? Did RNN Search actually translate better?
The quantitative results, yeah, were really clear. They measured performance using BLEU scores. That's a standard metric for translation quality.
Higher is better.
Higher is better, yes. And RNN Search consistently outperformed the standard RNNTech model across the board.
Okay, but by how much?
Significantly. What was really noteworthy was the improvement on longer sentences. For instance, the RNN Search model trained on sentences up to 50 words long. It got a BLEU score of 26.75 on the whole test set.
And the standard one, RNN Deck 50.
Only 17.82.
Wow, that's a huge jump. Nearly 9 BLEU points. That's not just a small tweak.
Exactly. It was a substantial leap forward. And maybe even more impressively when they looked just at sentences without any unknown words.
Yeah.
The RNN search model got a BLEU score of 34.16, which was remarkably close to a top conventional phrase-based system at the time called Moses.
Moses, the standard statistical system.
Yeah, a very strong baseline. Moses scored 35.63 on those sentences. And this is important, Moses had access to way more data, including lots of extra monolingual text. The neural nets only use the parallel data.
That is impressive, almost matching the big established system, but with less data, just by having a better architecture.
Pretty much. It showed the power of the approach.
And the paper also mentioned how RNN search handled longer sentences much better, right? There was a figure showing that.
Yes, exactly. There's a graph in the paper that really illustrates this point vividly.
Huh.
The performance of the standard RNN-NECTEC model just dropped off quite sharply as sentences got longer.
Like it was running out of memory or something.
Sort of, yeah, losing the plot from that single vector. But the BLEU scores for both RNN search models, the 30-word and 50-word versions stayed much more stable, even for sentences way longer than they were trained on, like over 50 words.
Really?
In fact, the RNN search model trained only on sentences up to 30 words still outperformed the RNN-NECTEC model trained on sentences up to 50 words once the sentences got long enough.
Okay, that's strong evidence. It really suggests the attention mechanism was overcoming that fixed vector bottleneck.
Definitely. The numbers were compelling.
But numbers only tell part of the story. What about like a more qualitative look? Could they actually see this soft alignment, this attention happening?
Yes, and that's one of the really cool parts of the paper. They included visualizations of the attention weights, those alpha values we talked about.
How did they visualize them?
They used these grids. Imagine the English source words along the bottom and the generated French translation going up the side. Each cell in the grid shows how much attention the model paid to a specific English word when it was generating a specific French word.
Like a heat map. Darker means more attention.
Exactly like heat map. Darker cells mean higher weights.
And what did these heat maps show? Did it look sensible?
Mostly, yes. They found the alignments were generally monotonic, meaning words tended to be translated in roughly the same order left to right. So you'd see strong weights, dark cells, mostly along the diagonal of the grid.
Which makes sense for languages like English and French, mostly.
Right. But they also found really interesting examples of non-monotonic alignments, which is crucial because word order often changes between languages.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, there's a great one translating European Economic Area to Zone Économique Européenne. The visualization clearly showed the model aligning the French word zone with the English word area.
Which are at opposite ends of the phrase.
Exactly. And then it correctly attended to the preceding English words European economic to generate the corresponding French adjectives économique européen in the right order after zone.
Wow. So it's not just word to word, it's figuring out phrase structure and reordering.
It seems to be learning something about the underlying grammar, yeah. Another neat example was translating the man to le homme.
Okay.
A strict word-for-word alignment isn't great there because the French article le changes to le before a vowel sound. Plus, you need to know man is masculine to pick le in the first place.
Right, context is key.
And the sauced alignment allowed the model to attend to both the and man simultaneously when deciding on le. It shows the flexibility, it doesn't force rigid one-to-one links, and handles these multi-word dependencies naturally.
That's much smarter than just forcing alignments. Okay, so attention works well for these tricky, shorter phrases, but the big claim was about long sentences. Did the qualitative examples back that up too?
They did. The paper included specific long English sentences from the test set and showed the translations from both models, RNN-NECTEC and RNN search.
And the difference was clear.
Oh, yeah. In these examples, the standard RNN-NECTEC model often started strong, but then kind of lost the plot towards the end of the long sentence. It might start making grammatical errors or just drift away from the original meaning.
Can you give a specific example of that kind of error?
Sure, there was one sentence about doctors admitting privileges at a hospital. The RNN-NECTEC model translated the beginning okay, but then it produced a phrase that meant something like the doctor's decision was based on his state of health.
That's completely wrong.
Totally missed the point. In contrast, the RNN search model produced a perfectly correct translation that kept the original meaning about hospital privileges intact, all the way through the long sentence.
That's a huge difference in accuracy and meaning preservation.
It really is. And they had similar examples like one about Disney trying to extend the life of its TV series. Again, RNN-NECTEC started okay, but then faltered. Later on, even missed a closing quote mark. RNN search, accurate and complete translation.
So these examples really drive home the point.
They do. They provide strong qualitative evidence, alongside the BLEU scores, that this attention mechanism really helped the model maintain focus and coherence over much longer stretches of text.
It's like the model has, well, actual attention span, like a careful reader, instead of just getting overwhelmed.
That's a good way to put it.
The paper also briefly mentioned connections to other research at the time, didn't it? How did this fit in?
Yeah, they pointed out some related work, like
Mhm.
work by Alex Graves on handwriting synthesis, which also used a kind of attention mechanism.
Handwriting, how does that relate?
Well, the model had to align the sequence of pen strokes it was generating with the sequence of characters it was supposed to write.
Mm.
So there's an alignment problem there, too.
Ah, I see.
But they highlighted a key difference. The handwriting model forced a strict monotonic alignment. You write letters in order. Machine translation needs more flexibility for word reordering.
Right, like the French example.
Exactly. They also briefly mentioned earlier attempts using neural networks in MT, but noted those often just plugged a neural net in as one component within a bigger traditional statistical system.
Whereas this was different.
Yes, this approach, and others emerging around the same time, aimed for a standalone, end-to-end neural translation system, a more radical shift.
Okay, so let's wrap up the core findings. What was the main contribution here? What did they really accomplish with this paper?
I think the central achievement was demonstrating that by introducing this attention mechanism, letting the model learn to align and translate simultaneously, they could significantly boost the performance of neural machine translation.
Especially for longer sentences where the old model struggled.
Precisely. Their RNN search architecture achieved translation quality that was genuinely competitive with the big, complex, phrase-based systems of the day. That was a major milestone.
And it wasn't just better numbers, right? The way it worked seemed more intuitive.
Yes, the soft alignments the model learned were often linguistically plausible. You could look at those visualizations and often see something that made sense.
Yeah.
They did acknowledge, though, that handling unknown words effectively was still a challenge, an area for future work.
So for me, the really key takeaway is this idea of the neural network learning to pay attention, to dynamically focus on relevant parts of the input as it goes along.
Mhm.
It just feels so much more intelligent, I guess, than just trying to cram everything into one fixed summary at the start.
Absolutely. It was a fundamental shift in perspective, and it really unlocked a lot of the progress we've seen in machine translation since then. Attention mechanisms are pretty much standard now.
It really makes you think about the bigger picture, doesn't it? I mean, more accurate, more nuanced machine translation, that has huge implications.
Oh, definitely. For how we communicate across languages,
Mm.
how we access information from around the world, maybe even for things like international relations.
It kind of leads to this question, right? As these AI models get better and better at understanding and translating our languages, what new possibilities open up? And maybe what new challenges arise in this super interconnected world we're building?
That's a deep question. It's something we'll likely be grappling with for a while.
Definitely something worth contemplating. And if you, the listener, are interested in digging deeper, I'd really encourage you to look up more recent developments in NMT. It hasn't stood still since this paper.
Not at all. Researchers are constantly building on these ideas, tackling low-resource languages, trying to get better context understanding beyond just single sentences.
It's a super fascinating and rapidly evolving field. Lots more to explore.